Okay, so with that, my friends, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to go forward and talk to you the best I can about this film, The Thing, in detail. And that will mean talking about specifics of the plot and the spoilers regarding the ending and the like. So if you have not seen The Thing, please turn off this video, and if you are okay with watching horror films, intense films, I cannot recommend this film strongly enough. I think, again, it's not for everyone. It is quite a gross film. It is an intense film, and so if you're not into horror films or that sort of thing, probably not for you. So you don't need to watch it if you don't like that sort of thing. But if you are into that sort of thing, or you are okay with horror films that have quite a certain degree of in-your-face scenes, then I think this is one to watch, and so I strongly recommend this film to you. And once you have seen this film, my friend, you can come back and watch this video or these videos. They will all be up here, and at that point, my friends, it will be my pleasure, my distinct pleasure, of hearing your thoughts and comments about what you think and how you reacted to the John Carpenter masterpiece, The Thing. Now, let's go into, I think this might be a great place to jump into questions that I think this film raises with respect to the characters and how the plot unfolds, and in particular, who is the thing and when. And so I want to get into some questions that I have and just things that I have thought of with respect to this film. So my discussion now will be focusing on questions that I have about the narrative and characters of this film. And this is very important because my discussion will be premised on the fact that the blood test scene is accurate. Okay, in other words, all the information that we receive in the blood test scene, I will assume to be accurate. I won't assume that there was any meddling with the blood. I won't assume that MacReady mixed around the blood dishes or anything like that. He didn't replace any blood. I mean, right? As great as that scene is in terms of revealing information, we don't necessarily, I mean, I can't say with certainty that nothing untoward or nothing suspicious could have happened. I mean, there is the small possibility that something might have been switched around. I mean, there isn't any indication of that, but of course there is a possibility that something could have happened, and that might have made the blood test inaccurate. Of course, I'm not saying that that is not impossible, but I think that we have to have some kind of reliance somewhere in order to have a basis of discussion. And so my reliance will be on the blood test and assuming that the blood test information is accurate. Therefore, my assumptions are that, my assumptions are that Norris was a thing, Palmer was a thing, and Blair was a thing. And also, my assumption, therefore, is that Windows was not a thing at the time of the blood test. MacReady was not a thing at the time of the blood test. Childs was not a thing at the time of the blood test. Gary was not a thing at the time of the blood test. And Knowles was not a thing at the time of the blood test. Also, Clark and Dr. Copper were not things at the time of the blood test. So those are my assumptions. Please note that I don't know, right? We don't know about Fuchs. And we also know about Bennings because we saw what happens to Bennings. But please note also that Fuchs was never subject to a blood test, and I think this is very significant. So these are my assumptions. Okay. So my first question that I have is, when did Blair become a thing? At what point did Blair become a thing? Now, I don't think the film presents any clear answer to this question. We do know that sometime between the start of the film and the end of the film, he became a thing. And we also know that a lot of things happened to him as a character in that interim. He started to, we see him, at least he seems to be thinking about what this thing can do. He then has his breakdown where he just goes berserk and just destroys the communications room, and he just chops up everything with the axe. We also understand that he just destroyed all the things in the helicopter. He also understand that he probably killed all the dogs with an axe. We also was locked up in a shed. Presumably for his own safety and that of the rest of the crew. And also he started to sow seeds of doubt, right, when he says, "Watch Clark," and also, and the like. But then we realize that he also says that it's not Fuchs, right? And then when we see him, or when they try to administer the blood test to him, we find that he is not there, but there is a tunnel that has been presumably freshly dug, and there is underneath that little shed a little cavern in the ice where the ship has been constructed, presumably by Blair, and we assume also, based on something that Gary says, based off of parts from the helicopter and the such. So, and then we see Blair later in terms of himself when he attacks Gary, and also Blair Thing in his full Thing glory. So then the question arises, when did Blair become a thing? When was he assimilated? Was he assimilated early, when he was still out and about in the camp, as it were? Or was he assimilated sometime later, maybe after he had been locked up in the shed in solitary confinement, as it were? And I think the question is really quite ambiguous, and it's difficult to answer. On the one hand, there is a scene around the middle when we see Blair alone looking at the computer and the analysis of the blood and how it assimilates, and also he asks the computer of the possibilities of the one or more members of the camp being infected, that being 75% probability, and also he sees the threat to humankind. So we see Blair looking at this data, and he holds a stopwatch and he's timing the time of assimilation, etc. So I think a lot of people, reasonably speaking, myself included, will look at this point and reasonably assume that at this point in time Blair is not yet assimilated. Right? Because why would an assimilated Blair be so interested in collecting all this data, which would then probably be saved in some data bank somewhere, etc., for someone to find, maybe some other member of the crew, or maybe someone else who might find the camp, etc. So we can, on the one hand, we can assume that at this point Blair is not yet a thing. And then at this point also we see him pull a gun from the drawer, and we also see an open, I think it's a bottle of Smirnoff drink by the computer. So at this point we might be able to assume that he is not a thing. So if we take this theory for what it's worth, namely the theory that Blair was not a thing up to the point where he was doing his analysis of the blood and the assimilation timing, etc. We think that therefore there is a possibility that at any point after this he could have been assimilated and turned into a thing. And so therefore he could have been a thing when he was doing the stuff with, shooting the gun, and he has that famous line, "I'll kill you," and all that, and then he is overcome and he's put into the shack. He could have been a thing at that point. He could have been human but then become assimilated after he was put in solitary confinement, etc. But my point therefore also is, if he was still human after he was put in solitary confinement, query exactly when he became assimilated, because even if he was assimilated, and even if he was an alien, and we can assume that he had this maybe superhuman strength or something which enabled him to dig the tunnel so quickly, etc., and construct all the stuff, consider, did he have enough time to do that? Or did he need a lot of time to do that stuff to begin with? And if so, then perhaps does that mean that he had to have been a thing from the point that he was initially confined in the solitary confinement situation to begin with? And so all these questions pop up as to when exactly he was a thing. And this is a very important point. Please note that when he's put into the shed for the first time, and he's there alone with MacReady, and Blair says to MacReady, "I don't know who to trust." And then he says, "Watch Clark," the famous line, "Watch Clark." Note that MacReady takes a sip of the Smirnoff. We don't see it. It kind of occurs off camera, but we see MacReady grab the bottle, and we see him open the bottle, and we see it off camera. We hear the little him take a drink and then put it down. The assumption being that he took a drink from the bottle. Now, if Blair was already a thing, and if Blair had been assimilated, and if after he had been assimilated he had taken a drink from the same Smirnoff bottle, then MacReady, who, let's assume he's a human at that point, if he were human at that point, he is taking a drink of the Smirnoff bottle from that had been drunk by Blair, who had already been assimilated, which is actually very dangerous. It actually exposes MacReady to possible risk of assimilation himself. That's assuming that Blair is a thing at this point. But even with that point of the Smirnoff bottle, I should point out that, remember the scene going back to the analysis of the blood that Blair handles by himself. We see the bottle and we see him opening the drawer to pull out the gun, but we never see him drink. So it could be that at that point when he was still human, assuming that he took a drink. But then after he was assimilated, he no longer had the opportunity to take a drink from the bottle. So even if Blair were a thing by the time he was put into solitary confinement, it could still be that he didn't take a drink from that bottle. Therefore, it is still possible that even though Blair was a thing at that point, Blair thing didn't drink from the Smirnoff bottle that MacReady eventually drank from, or took one sip from. So MacReady might or might not necessarily have exposed himself to risk of becoming assimilated. So even under this Blair theory, there's still hope for MacReady. Okay. I should point out here, though, that I think also there is a possibility that Blair was assimilated prior to the computer analysis test. Now, why do I say this? There are actually a number of reasons. First, go back to the Stuart Cohen commentary from the Scream Factory Blu-ray release of The Thing. Stuart Cohen is actually asked this question by the moderator of that commentary, and he gives really interesting information. He actually says that based on his understanding or feeling of the story, Blair was actually assimilated quite early, and according to Stuart Cohen, this is supposed to mirror what happens in the original novella. Now, I'm not quite sure about that last detail, but if we were to take Stuart Cohen's commentary at its word, then we can therefore assume the possibility that Blair was assimilated prior to the computer analysis scene. Now, it's interesting because the moderator actually asks about this, and he says, I would always assume that Blair wasn't assimilated yet because he wasn't yet assimilated by the time we come to that scene. He's still human. That's my assumption. But I still think that there is room for the possibility that Blair was a thing even at the computer analysis test. Now, why do I say this? How could that explain the fact that Blair is doing this examination of the assimilation and the testing of the dog cells, etc.? That's a good question, and one that I don't have an answer to, except to say that we don't know the makeup of the thing. We don't know what the thinking of the thing. We don't know what the specific plans of the thing are. We don't know what its philosophy is, except in terms of survival. Heck, we don't know how the thing interacts with other assimilated things. We can assume that there might be a sense of teamwork going on, and I'll get to that in a second, but we don't know. We have no idea of what the thing is. I mean, if we think about the human race, not all human beings work together harmoniously, right? There can be senses of discord amongst human beings. Well, it's certainly possible that even among different things, they might not all necessarily be working towards the same goal. They might all be disagreeing with each other or something like that. And so my point here is that the thing, even when assimilated, perhaps might be possibly going through some kind of thinking. It wouldn't necessarily be something that is something that I could refute necessarily, namely that maybe if Blair were assimilated at this point, maybe Blair thing was interested in how fast assimilation occurred, right? I mean, human beings are often curious about how the human body works. Why can't it be the same for things, right? Why can't the thing be curious about how the thing operates, what the reactions are with the thing cells, etc.? I mean, I think that's a very, it's not outside the realm of possibility necessarily. This is all to say that I think Blair as a character is totally up in the air. I think it is fair to say that he could have been assimilated early, middle, or late in the game, and I think there are arguments for and against such arguments or such suppositions or theories. This is therefore to say that this film presents so many mysteries, and I think the discussions or the potentials for discussions are endless. And this is only just for Blair. And my gosh, I mentioned MacReady and the sip of Smirnoff, right? Depending on which theory you espouse, that changes the game for all the other characters, because there's such a connection of networking going on in terms of the possibilities of assimilation. It's really quite incredible. So that's Blair. Okay, that's the question of Blair. Okay. What about Fuchs? As I said before, of all the characters, based on the blood test and based on other scenes that we see, the only character that we never quite are sure of is Fuchs. We never see him subjected to a blood test. We don't know how he died. We just see him wander out of the lab after the lights have gone down. We see him with the lighter, or not the lighter, but the light that he's trying to guide through in the dark, and we see a shadow pass through him, pass by him in front of him, and he goes out into the snowy night, and then he goes and he sees something in the snow, and he pulls up something, and it says MacReady, and that's it. That's all we see. And it cuts to MacReady asking about if anyone's seen Fuchs, and it's been an hour. Any one of us could have gotten to him. And then they go try to find Fuchs, and they find a burnt-up, charred body. And then they see the glasses, and they assume that these are the charred remains of Fuchs, and that he is now dead. And then the assumption being that maybe he found out something, or according to MacReady's supposition, maybe the thing got to it and was trying to assimilate him. Maybe it was trying to burn the thing, or maybe he was trying to burn himself before it could get to him, which is a frightening concept if that were true. But this still leaves the question open as to, was Fuchs a thing or not? I think there is room to consider the possibility that Fuchs was a thing. Now, I know that there are scenes that might suggest that he wasn't a thing, and I think those are still valid. For instance, look at his reaction in the lab when when MacReady approaches him, and then he's very scared at first. He grabs the bottle there, and then he says, if this thing can attack us on a sort of microscopic level, I suggest that we all prepare our own meals, and we should eat out of cans, that sort of thing. Also, if Fuchs was a thing, remember there was a scene early on before Bennings is assimilated, when Fuchs asks to speak to MacReady by himself, the two of them, and so they go out into one of the vehicles outside, and it's just the two of them, and then Fuchs and MacReady are talking, and Fuchs is talking to him about Blair and about his concerns about Blair, and he's looking through Blair's notebooks, and they figure out that Blair thinks that there is still cellular activity in these charred remains, and that sets off the alarm bells, as I said. Well, if they were together, the two of them alone, and if Fuchs was a thing, then this would have been a prime opportunity for Fuchs' thing, if he were a thing, to attempt to assimilate MacReady. So then the question, therefore, is maybe he wasn't a thing. Maybe he was human all along. And I think there's a great, I think that interpretation is really valid. And I actually probably in my heart believe that Fuchs was human, even up to the very end. However, there are indications that Fuchs could have been a thing. Not only, well, remember when when Blair is put into his solitary confinement, and then it's just, what is it? It's then there's a group of them outside. It's MacReady, it's Childs, it's Fuchs, Dr. Copper, and Gary. So the 5 of them are still out there in the snow, and they're talking about, how would you know, or Childs asks, how would you know, if I were a thing and I were a perfect imitation, how would you know? And then this is where MacReady asks Dr. Copper, is there some kind of test? And then Dr. Copper says, well, I think there was a test. Something I've been thinking about, a sort of blood serum test, in terms of how he thought there might be a test of seeing how we could, the reaction of human blood to infected blood, and seeing the reaction and that sort of thing. And that would require the reliance upon human blood samples of all the members, which is kept in storage, and people knew this. We never hear of this blood serum test from Dr. Copper until now. And so remember, the only people at this point who know of this test are these 5 people. Also note that Dr. Copper and Blair and Fuchs are probably the 3 members of the crew who have to work together in terms of their medical expertise and their laboratory studies, etc. So this probably wouldn't be something that Dr. Copper would be saying to other members of the crew, other than those 4 other members that are there present at that scene, and also Blair, and also Fuchs is also there, by the way. So at this point in time, it's very reasonable to assume that the only people who could have known about Dr. Copper's thinking about this blood test are MacReady, Childs, Fuchs, Gary, and Blair, right? So of those people, who could have gotten into the blood, and who could have gotten in and destroyed all the blood samples? We don't know, but Fuchs is there. Fuchs is one of the people. Now, please also note that there is a theory that is going on with the thing about the keys, right? Because the only way to access the blood samples is if one had the keys. Now, we understand that Gary had the keys, and so the suspicion falls on Gary. If Gary was the only one who had access, or Dr. Copper only had limited access based on the fact that Gary had the keys, then all suspicion lies on Gary when the blood samples are found to be destroyed, right? But remember, early on in the film, when Bennings is being assimilated, we understand that Windows had the keys, but when Windows is shocked to see Bennings in mid-assimilation, we hear the keys drop, and then all this chaos happens with Bennings, and then them trying to destroy Bennings' thing, etc. We don't know what happens to the keys in this interim because of all this chaos that's happening. All we know is, it's very possible. And then another key of information that's very important is that next time we see the keys, we actually see the keys stuck on the belt of Gary, when Gary is there as being one of the people who is on alert when Blair is on his rampage in the communications room. So this is very important. So we know, therefore, that the keys were unaccounted for between the point in time when Bennings was being assimilated and then the point in time when Blair was doing his attack on the communications room. So during this time, we don't know what happened to the keys. Every time from the Blair attack scene onwards, we can assume that unless there is something going on with the keys, what we don't know about because the film didn't provide us any information, we can probably assume that the keys were always on Gary's body. Okay, so if Dr. Copper is going back to when Blair is now in solitary confinement, and then Dr. Copper is outside with the 4 other men talking about his thoughts of a blood serum test, then after that we immediately go to the scene of Windows discovering the blood being destroyed. Okay, so there wouldn't have been enough time to get into the blood samples immediately, or in between the point when Dr. Copper mentioned his thing about the test and then when Windows discovered it being broken into. So if the keys were used to break into the safe to destroy the blood samples during the time when Bennings was assimilated and then the time when Blair was doing his attack, who could have had access to the keys? Okay, I think there are a number of people who could have had access to the keys, but Fuchs, it's possible that he could have had access to the keys and destroyed the blood samples at that point in time. My point is that Fuchs would have been one of the few people who would have had knowledge, or who could have had knowledge of Dr. Copper's ideas about the blood test prior to Dr. Copper actually mentioning it on screen at this point in time, because of Fuchs' closeness with Dr. Copper and Blair as a kind of research assistant, etc. So that is, I think, evidence, or not evidence, but possibility suggesting that Fuchs could have been the thing. Just one more thing about Fuchs. I should say that there is the scene where Fuchs is seen leaving the lab after he hears someone, maybe outside, maybe it's a thing, and he goes outside and he sees that piece of clothing and the name MacReady on it. Now this might suggest that Fuchs is not a thing, on the one hand, because he is discovering this item which may or may not necessarily make MacReady fall under suspicion. Right? But I think this would not necessarily discount the possibility that Fuchs is indeed a thing. Now hear me out here. It is possible that there is some kind of teamwork going on amongst the members who are infected or have become things. And so remember that this piece of clothing is later found, I think, in the furnace in MacReady's shack when MacReady, Knowles, and Windows go and inspect it. So I would say that this could be an indication perhaps of maybe some teamwork going on amongst members who are things. In other words, one of the other people who are the thing maybe was trying to pass off some information or pass off something to Fuchs, who might have been a thing himself. Or another possibility is that maybe the things are not necessarily in communication with each other. In other words, they might not necessarily be working as a team, as it were. I mean, that's another interesting concept which I don't really know the answer to. If you have multiple people who are the thing, is there some way for them to communicate, or do they not have any awareness or cognizance of the existence or the thinking of other members of the thing, or are they competing with each other, etc.? So the fact that Fuchs finds this doesn't necessarily suggest that he is not a thing or that he is a thing. So in other words, I think it's a scene that is still subject to some degree of ambiguity, or at least the possibility still remains open for Fuchs to be a thing, even though I think the more common interpretation of this scene of Fuchs is that he was human, which then leads to the ambiguity surrounding his death. You know, why was he killed exactly? Was it indeed how MacReady described it, namely he was trying to fend off the thing, and instead of becoming assimilated, he decided to essentially immolate himself, maybe trying to prevent any further assimilation from occurring? That's a real possibility. But again, we don't know the details as to Fuchs's death, so we can only speculate, as far as you know, the other characters have been speculating about his death as well. So if we want to play the speculation game, and we can think of all sorts of scenarios. Some scenarios where he might be human, or other scenarios where he might be a thing. I think the human scenarios are the ones that MacReady and company seem to have come up with. But let's take the scenario, or the scenario, yes, where Fuchs is indeed a thing. Then why would he have been killed? Perhaps someone else in the camp was onto him, and for whatever reason they didn't disclose that information. That possibility seems somewhat unlikely, because if indeed another member of the camp who is human was onto Fuchs, who was a thing, then I think that member would have told everyone else, and the fact that no one told anyone probably makes that scenario least likely. Another possibility is, again, what I was trying to suggest earlier, is we don't know the way in which the things, assuming that there are multiple, the things relate to each other. Are they working with each other? Are they one organism? Are they separate organisms? Are they competing with each other? And the like. So assuming the possibility that the things are not necessarily working with each other, and also assuming the possibility that the things might be working against each other or competing against each other, it is possible that maybe one of the things killed off Fuchs, who was a thing. I don't know. I mean, again, we are then speculating on the nature and makeup of the thing itself, how it thinks, how it reacts, how it tends to react when there are other things about, etc. And this goes into much deep speculation that is, I think, conjecture, but still worth thinking about. Again, this film lends itself so wonderfully to this idea of constant thinking, constant imagining of possible scenarios. The possibilities, I think, are endless. And I think I just want to suggest the fact that at least the reading of the Fuchs storyline does lend itself to some degree anyway to this consideration of the infinite possibilities, let me put it that way. So that is my general take on the way in which one might perhaps approach the Fuchs storyline. Then another question that I have is essentially, when we have characters who are seen in pairs, that is, when we have scenes of just two characters together, does that therefore mean that those two characters are not things? Right? And the reason why I ask this is because there are a number of scenes that we see with just two characters on screen. But the fact that we don't necessarily see any assimilation, or also the fact that later on we might see one of the characters in the blood test scene, for example, who is proven by that scene to be human. Therefore, we can assume that no assimilation takes place between those two characters in those scenes where it's just two characters. But does that automatically mean that therefore both characters are not things? Okay, I'm not explaining myself well, but let me give you an example. So an example I gave earlier was Fuchs and MacReady alone in that little tractor truck outside, where Fuchs is talking to MacReady about how he's worried about Blair and how Fuchs was reading Blair's notebooks, etc. So the fact that we don't see any assimilation occur, MacReady assimilating Fuchs or Fuchs assimilating MacReady, might therefore suggest to us that neither one of those characters at that point in time is a thing, right? Okay, that's a possibility. Another scene that's worth thinking of is early on. This is before, just before the dog is brought into the kennel, and before the dog is revealed to be a thing. The dog is seen excuse me, the dog is seen walking through the rec room rather aimlessly. It's walking under the table where the three men are playing cards. It's Gary and Bennings and Norris. You see those three men playing cards, and then the dog walks under, and Bennings is rather startled by this, and so Bennings urges Clark to put the dog in the kennel. And then you note immediately that Gary is back intent on his cards, and then Bennings is also intent on his cards. Of those three, the only man who is sort of looking back and looking rather curiously at the dog at that point is Norris. So Norris seems to have an interesting curiosity with the dog for whatever reason. Is this an indication that Norris is already assimilated? Who knows? But anyway, prior to this, or around this time, we also get the scene, not in the rec room, but in one of the I would say bedrooms, where we have Childs and Palmer together alone. At least they're the only two together. They share, I think it must be a joint, I think, and they're watching a recording of a game show. And Palmer actually stops it midway and he says, "I know the ending of this," so he changes the tape or something. And it's just the two of them. Well, there isn't any assimilation of Childs, right? Because Childs has been proven to be human in the blood test later on. We know that Palmer at some point in the film becomes assimilated, but we don't know when. The fact that Childs isn't assimilated, and the fact that Palmer and Childs apparently are together alone in this room, might suggest that because Palmer didn't assimilate Childs, maybe this could suggest that at this point in time, Palmer is not a thing. Okay, that's another possibility. Another scene where you've got two characters together is you've got Blair and Clark, and they're in the dog kennel, and they're seen, I think Blair is seen injecting something in one of the dogs. Now, I don't know if they're putting the dogs down, because Clark doesn't seem to be agitated by that. So based on Clark's reaction, it would seem that maybe they're applying some kind of medication to calm the dogs down. I'm not sure, but based on Clark's reaction, I don't think they're putting the dogs down necessarily. But the point I'm trying to make is it's only Blair and it's Clark, and the dog is medicated in some way. So because of the dog's medication, we can count the scene as being between the two men, Blair and Clark. Now, this is where Blair questions Clark, how long were you alone with the dog? The dog who ended up becoming a thing in the kennel. And then Clark says, an hour and a half maybe. And so there are some seeds of suspicion that are being sown by the mere fact that Blair is asking a question. Now, query. They're alone, we assume, together in the kennel. Now, why, if Blair was a thing at this point, why didn't he try to assimilate Clark? Now, that's an interesting question. So that could be suggestive of the fact that Blair is not a thing. Okay, that could be suggestive. Okay, so we've got these interesting situations where we've got two characters on screen, and the fact that we don't see any assimilation going on might be suggestive of them not being things at that point in time. But what makes this film rather fascinating is that we're not sure. I'm not sure. Let's take the let's take the general supposition. Okay, how do we know, first of all, that the thing will always try to assimilate that which it is in close proximity with? We're not sure. We don't know the nature of the thing in the sense of how it expends energy, what it needs in order to maintain a kind of sustenance. Maybe it can't constantly be on the lookout for assimilation. Maybe it needs to rest. I don't know. So it's not necessarily the case where we have to assume, although we could, but we don't have to assume that the thing will always be trying to assimilate all the time. That's not necessarily the case, I think. At least it's possible to think that way. Another thing to think about is it could be strategic on the part of the thing not to try to assimilate because of what I was suggesting now. In other words, if you have two characters together and one doesn't assimilate the other, then that creates a level of trust, perhaps. It does, at least in me and the viewer. I think, at least immediately, I think, oh, this person mustn't be the thing, because they would have assimilated the other guy otherwise. But maybe that's something that is being done on purpose as a kind of tactic in order to play on one's feelings of trust later on for some strategic reason. I don't know. We know that, at least in the context of the thing when it is Blair thing, we know that Blair thing is very smart, very intelligent. It could be because Blair himself was a very intelligent man to begin with, but Blair and possibly Blair thing, depending on when Blair was assimilated, did show signs of almost being quite Machiavellian in terms of how he was trying to manipulate the crew. This is assuming that Blair thing knew what he was doing early on, prior to him being sort of incarcerated there. But my point is that the thing does have the potential of exhibiting high levels of intelligence, and so it is possible that it is trying to strategize, and perhaps part of its strategy is not necessarily going for the immediate assimilation even when it has the chance, and that is to create a sense of trust, which it can then use to its advantage later on for whatever purpose. I don't know. Speaking of strategy, I think this also could be a possible explanation as to why Blair didn't assimilate Clark during the scene which I described. And here's something to keep in mind, and this relates to the earlier discussion I was having as to when Blair was assimilated. Now, when the dog thing went into the kennel, right? Recall that the dogs were really agitated. They knew almost immediately that this wasn't a real dog, and they were really reacting violently to it. They were about to attack it when the thing had to reveal itself. So I think it could be said that the dogs knew that this was not a real dog, it was a thing. So they had some kind of innate sense of being able to detect. Now, this isn't played out in the film later on, but I think one might reasonably take from this scene the fact that maybe the dogs could sense which what was real and what was thing, if you know what I mean. And so if this were taken to a logical conclusion, then it might have been possible that the dogs could have detected which of the humans were indeed human and which were indeed things. Now, granted, this isn't something that is played out in the film because we don't see a lot of the dogs in action after this particular kennel scene. And in fact, the only time we see the dogs are when Blair is injecting this medication to one of the dogs with Clark present in that scene that I'm talking about. And also later, after we see Blair on his rampage, Clark runs to the kennel and he sees the dog with the axe in it. And we assume that this was Blair's handiwork, that he killed the dogs in the kennel with the axe. So what are we to make of this? I think we can make of this some interesting possibilities. That it is, one possibility is that it is what it is, and that these characters were human at the time and they are simply trying to take care of these dogs. And also, by extension, Blair was still human when he was on his rampage, and therefore he was just killing the dogs as a means of eradicating any possibilities of any infected dogs there. Okay, that's a possibility. But another possibility, which I think it makes this film very fascinating, is that let's assume that Blair was a thing at that particular point. What would be the reason for Blair Thing to not want to assimilate Clark? If we could take the possibility that the dogs could detect which were human and which were things, Clark, being the person who is in the most proximity and spends the most time with the dogs, would probably be in the company of the dogs most often. And based on this theory, we could then say that it would be against the thing's interests to have Clark assimilated, because if Clark is exposed to all the dogs, and let's assume that the dogs have the ability to detect which is thing and which is not, then the dogs would therefore detect immediately that Clark was a thing, and that would basically leave him exposed, or leave the thing exposed, if Clark were indeed assimilated at that time. So Blair, being a smart person, and let's assume that Blair Thing is also equally smart, probably could deduce that assimilating Clark would not be to its advantage, because it would probably lead to Clark Thing's downfall, because he was surrounded by the dogs. Note also that Blair killed the dog with the axe in the kennel, and also in the scene Blair is seen medicating this dog. So there is no possibility of any other dog reacting to Blair. We don't see any dog reacting to Blair, so there is no chance of any dog sensing whether or not Blair is a Blair Thing or Blair human, you know what I mean? And the fact that he also killed the dogs when he was on his rampage, I think is very interesting. If Blair was indeed a Blair Thing, we might take that to mean that maybe he was doing it as a tactical reason to protect himself, assuming, of course, we buy the theory that the dogs might have been able to read who was human and who was not human. So a lot of this, I understand, has to do with supposition. A lot of this has to do with assuming maybe a couple steps beyond what the film isn't necessarily presenting. I totally get that. I totally do. But it's very, I think, worthwhile to think about these combinations of possibilities, because, as I say, the film doesn't present its answers with very easily. And I think it's left to us to try to determine these. And I think the more that we think about it, I think the more possibilities arise. And the fact that we can think about it like this makes this film, I think, eternally ponderable. We can ponder its possibilities, its mysteries, try to find answers on our own, but that the fact that it still is something that is worth considering, and it's something that we can think about even years after this film is made, I think adds to its longevity. So these are just some of the examples of some of those questions that I have. Just rounding out this conversation, if I may. So some other questions that I think are possible are some of the more, I think, well-known questions that arise with respect to the thing, namely concerning the ending. So was Childs a thing? Was MacReady a thing? what happens to these characters at the end. Now, this, I think, goes towards some of the theories that have been posited, I think, rather reasonably over the course of many years, that have to do with how certain characters are shot. For instance, some people believe, based, I think, in large part by Dean Cundy and his comments in the commentary, for instance, about how Palmer is lit during the blood test scene. There's a particular shot just before he's exposed when you don't see any light, any shine in his eyes, and so that is, Dean Cundy seems to be suggesting that that was shot in a particular purposeful way to not show any reflection of light from his eyes, to suggest that as a subliminal message that he was in fact a thing. And so I think some theories therefore posit that whenever you see a character that's shot without any of that reflective, that dot in their eyes, that might be suggestive of the fact that they are indeed a thing. It's a worthwhile theory. I think it's very good. I would just point one to the fact that even in that same blood test scene, when MacReady is giving his explanation, and we've got that lovely pan across all the characters, Windows, then Palmer, then Gary, then Childs, then Knowles. Note at that particular moment you can actually see the glare of light in Palmer's eyes, and so it doesn't really occur, I think, consistently throughout even that single scene. And also you can see glints of light from like Blair, when Blair is attacking Gary, for instance, and the thing. So I think it's just for that particular moment just before Palmer becomes a thing. I don't think it's necessarily consistent throughout the film, although I could be wrong. But my take is that that is not necessarily an indication that I would necessarily rely on throughout the entire film, but maybe just for that particular moment, just before Palmer explodes into his thing identity. Okay. Another theory that is using a similar sort of visual type of logic is at the end with Childs. The fact, for instance, that there's a particular part where Childs isn't seen necessarily, or his breath isn't necessarily visible on camera, that might be suggestive of the fact that he is a thing when he is talking with MacReady at the end there. Although I would suggest that when he's standing up in that particular scene, as he's approaching MacReady, who's right there alone in the snow, you can actually see faint wisps of breath from his mouth. So perhaps it's hard to see how that visual theory would, in other words, maybe there isn't necessarily a consistent whole with that, but it's worth pondering, that's for sure. And also there's a theory about what MacReady actually gave to Childs, who then drank out of the bottle. Was it really whiskey, or was it something else? If it was something else, maybe that was a test by MacReady to see if Childs was indeed a thing or not. If he was human, he would have reacted in a certain way, but he didn't. He reacted as though it were drink. So that might be a certain test. Now that I'm not particularly sure of. I can see the possibility of this and any other of the theories, but I would be, I'm actually of the position that I don't know what Childs is at the end there, and I would say that the possibility, there is the possibility that Childs became a thing. There's a possibility that MacReady became a thing. There is even the possibility that Knowles and Gary could have become the thing after the end of the blood test scene, because remember, after the end of the blood test scene, and they realize that all four men who are surviving after the end of the blood test scene, Knowles, Childs, Gary, and MacReady, at the end of that scene, we know that they're all human. But remember, the film then fades to black, and then we get that lovely sort of gliding pan shot of the camera moving through the corridors and then going to Childs at the doorway, and we realize that it's essentially a POV shot of MacReady, which is a very significant shot, by the way. But in between that fade out and that pan shot, we don't know what happened to any of these characters. We don't know. I mean, they weren't necessarily together all the time. So, and remember, there were those drops of blood of Palmer that ran away. We don't know if they were able to catch those bits of blood at the end there, or were they able to escape? If so, were they lurking in the shadows, and maybe when no one was looking, maybe they latched onto one of the people? I don't know, and they started assimilating. I don't know. So what's wonderful about that moment is that the fade out really leaves open the possibility that even after the definitiveness of the end of the blood test scene, we still have the possibility that maybe one or more of the people could have become the thing. Some people might suggest maybe Gary didn't become the thing, that he was still human. That's because of the fact that Blair attacked him with that thing with the mouth there. But I would actually suggest that alone, it could suggest that he was human, but it might not necessarily suggest that he was human. Again, if we go with the notion that maybe the things are not necessarily working with each other, they could be, but if we assume that they're not, Gary could have been a thing. And the fact that Blair put his hand like that, I mean, it's not necessarily suggestive of human flesh, you know. There wasn't any kind of digging, and there wasn't any kind of breaking of skin. You know, it was kind of a smooth way of getting his hand in there, and I don't know, it felt almost alien-like. I'm not sure. It could have been suggestive of maybe Blair sucking something or absorbing something, I don't know, but the flesh of Gary seemed to be a somewhat gelatin-like, and so maybe Gary was a thing and maybe Blair was attacking that separate thing, who knows, which could suggest the fact, which could be also suggestive of the because Blair didn't choose to assimilate Gary. He chose to absorb Gary. So I don't know, that's an interesting theory. We don't know what happened to Knowles because he walks down the corridor and we never see him again after the cut. So we don't know what happened, although we can assume he met a similar fate as Gary. But again, if we think of the same possible scenarios and ambiguities with respect to Gary's character, however far-reaching you think they are, I think the same can be applied to Knowles and his character. So there is still the possibility that he was a thing. Then we have, but of course, if they were things, then the question would be, then why would they be trying to help MacReady blow up the place, right? That would seem to be against their interests. And I think that's also a strong possibility. And don't get me wrong, I think that they are human at that point, but I'm just trying to present possibilities. And I think we could explain that, at least perhaps anyway, by the fact that things don't necessarily have to be logical. You know, like with, you know, not everyone in the human race is necessarily logical, right? Not everyone in the human race necessarily acts what seems to be in his or her own best interests. Sometimes, who knows, maybe there is a suicidal tendency to things that we don't know about. Again, we don't know what the psychological nature of things are. And so I think the possibility, if we assume that the possibilities are endless with respect to human nature and human psychology, I think we can perhaps say, or at least we don't necessarily have to deny the fact that similar kind of complex psychology might also be possible for things. Okay, so that's all I want to say about that. But I do appreciate the fact that it's probably more likely than not that Gary and Knowles are not things, that they are humans. Okay. What about MacReady? I think the same could be said for MacReady. Again, one can apply the same kind of theoretical possibility that one applied to Gary and Knowles, or at least what I did before. But again, we also see MacReady acting in a way that seems to be against Blair Thing's interest. And so, is he a thing? Is he not a thing? Again, what is the thing psychology, etc.? I think the same sort of arguments could apply, which might leave room for the possibility that even at that point MacReady is a thing. But again, he seems to be acting more against the thing's interests than his own. So maybe MacReady is still human at this point. Again, but again, I want to leave open the possibility. That leaves Childs. And again, we don't know the situation with Childs. All we know is that we get when MacReady and Knowles and Gary are up there, they go into Blair's cabin, they don't find him there. We then get this very mysterious shot back in the main part of the base, or the camp, the camera moves, it floats, it goes down, it looks down towards the stairwell that leads to the underground generator room, and goes back up and goes to the place where we saw Childs standing on guard, but Child is no longer there. The door is open. But what's interesting is that there is some snow that has seemed to have accumulated, and despite the fact that the snow is very intense now, I would say that the amount of snow that's accumulated at this point would seem to suggest that the door was open for quite a significant amount of time. In other words, it wasn't open immediately at that particular moment, because the snow there wouldn't have been enough time for the snow to accumulate as such. So the door would have been open for a considerable amount of minutes, shall we say. Why? What was the reason for the door being open for that amount of time? And therefore, what would be reason for there to be any delay between the door opening and then Child seen, or someone being seen by Knowles running out into the snow like that? We assume it's Child's, but we're not sure. There are so many mysteries here that are just not solved here, and I don't think there is any sort of easy explanation here. There are visual clues, I think, that could suggest that Child is indeed a thing, but again, we're not sure. And once again, I would point your attention to the fact that the film ends with yet another scene of just two characters. I mentioned the two-character dynamic in other scenes, but here is the ultimate two-character dynamic. It's MacReady and Childs. Now, I think on the one hand, it's very easy to, and I'm not easy, I don't think easy is the right word. I think it's very reasonable to guess or assume that at this point Childs is a thing, and he has joined MacReady, I don't know, maybe for one last hurrah, as it were, and then MacReady hands him the bottle. Please note, MacReady is not seen having a drink from the same bottle after Childs drinks it. He just laughs when he sees Childs drink it. So they don't share a bottle necessarily, but he gives the bottle over to Childs, which I think is a very important detail. But Childs could be a thing at this point. But also think about the fact that it's just the two of them. If it's just the two of them, why wouldn't Childs, if he were a thing, just go over and try to assimilate MacReady? Right? It would seem pretty logical for that to occur. Why would the thing want to, what would be the reason for the thing not to want to assimilate if there's no one else but the two of them, if indeed Childs was a thing? So again, so therefore that could suggest that Childs is indeed human. Okay, and the same goes for MacReady too. If the fact that MacReady doesn't assimilate Childs, if MacReady is a thing, that could lead to the fact that MacReady is also human. Okay, but then we go back to what I was saying before about maybe it's a strategic thing. Maybe the thing doesn't necessarily want to assimilate every single time. Maybe it has to do with its own sort of digestive system and nutrition. Maybe it doesn't have enough energy. Remember, this is at the very end of the film, so we can assume that Childs is very tired here. So maybe even if Childs were a thing, maybe we could, it's possible that it didn't have enough nutritional sustenance at that point to actually carry out the assimilation process, etc. Okay, maybe it takes a lot of calories or something, I don't know. So these sorts of considerations go on. And so I just want to point this out because it just meant to suggest that even if I go with one possibility, Childs is a thing, I think there are elements that bring me back to the other possibility, Childs is human. But then that brings me back to other possibilities, leading me to thinking that Childs is a thing. But then that brings me back to other ideas bring me back to maybe Childs is human. And this sort of ping pong match in my mind just go back and forth. It's endless. It's absolutely endless. And it's fascinating. And this is just an example of this sort of ping pong match. I think this is true of many other elements of this film. And that is why I brought up these questions that I have, because I just want to be very clear that I am not sure. I think at this particular moment, I think maybe this or that, but that is always subject to change. And my reason for bringing up this discussion like I did was not to definitively say one thing or another, but just to present how I approach this film and why this film confuses me, but why I think that such confusion leads to so many possibilities, and it's so much fun to consider. And I think it's that possibility of consideration that makes this film so enjoyable and so watchable and endless in terms of its entertainment value, and also in terms of what it provides or what it doesn't provide, in terms of the answers that it yields or the answers that it doesn't yield, etc. In other words, its mysteries remain mysterious, and they are subject to scrutiny and endless theorizing, which is wonderful, but still, ultimately, they remain deep-rooted mysteries, which is absolutely brilliant.